Today we will continue our story of Abraham Lincoln. On Monday, we learned of a young boy who was born into a one-room log cabin in the state of Kentucky. A little later, his father wanted to move further into the wilderness, and so he and his family traveled over 100 miles and they moved into the state of Indiana. Today we're going to pick up where we left off. Abe wanted to read and to study, but school was far away and he had to stay at home to help on the farm. The hard work made him big and husky, and he could outrun and outwrestle all the other boys of his age. Even quicker than his legs ran his wit, so he became leader of all the boys who lived around Little Pigeon Creek. Abe hadn't much time to play, but sometimes at night he and his friends stole out to a salt lick in the woods. There they hid behind trees and watched the shy deer licking the salty slabs. But Abe never went hunting as other boys and menfolk did. He loved the animals and wouldn't harm them. For 2 happy years, Abe and his family lived in the house in the woods near wolves and grumbling bears. But when he was 9, a dangerous sickness came to the wilderness, and his mother took sick and died. Then the woods seemed gloomy and dark, and the days grew long for Sally and Abe. A year or so later, their father went off on a trip, and for many weeks, Abe and Sally were left all alone. Then one day, a big wagon, drawn by 4 horses, stopped in front of the cabin. Out of the wagon jumped their father and a kind, rosy-cheeked woman. She ran over to Abe and Sally and hugged them. She had come to be their new mother. The stepmother had brought her 3 children and all her household goods. They unloaded a chest, a table, chairs, and feather beds, pots and knives and forks and spoons. So smooth and fine was the furniture that Abe could run his hands over it without getting splinters in his fingers. And the stepmother climbed up to the loft where Abe slept. She threw out the leaves that had been his bedding and gave him a soft feather bed instead. Then she put the father to work to make a real door, a window, and a wooden floor for the cabin. She washed and scrubbed the cabin both high and low and took charge of the family right away. "Let Abe have time to read," she said when she saw how eager to learn he was. At night, after the others had gone to sleep, she let him lie by the fireplace and study. In the flickering light, he practiced writing and reading. He wrote with charcoal on a wooden shovel and read the Bible, stories about George Washington, Pilgrim's Progress, and every other book he could get. Books were scarce in the wilderness, but Abe didn't mind walking 20 miles to borrow one. See Abe climbing up into the loft. This is the area where he would sleep. This was also a one-room cabin, but often they would build these little areas. It wasn't really a room, it was more like attic space where kids could sleep up top. When Abe grew too tired to read any more, he climbed up the pegs in the wall to his loft. Before going to sleep, he took the book he had been reading in a crack in the roof to keep it safe. But once a storm came up in the night, and when Abe woke up, his book was soaking wet and spoiled. He had borrowed this book from a rich farmer, and for 3 long days Abe had to husk corn to pay for it. "No one can beat Abe Lincoln at farm work," said the neighbors. It was known for miles around how quick he was at splitting logs into fence rails. But when someone passed by, he would sit on the fence he had made and talk, asking questions to learn new things. Then the neighbors thought he was lazy, and when he walked between the handles of his plow reading a book, they thought he was odd. So Abe was a hard worker. He was well known for being a very diligent worker. He was strong, but he also loved to take time to stop and read and learn. Abe grew straight up into the air like a fir tree. Long and thin he was, with big hands and feet jutting out. His buckskin breeches were always too short and too tight, and made blue circles on his legs where they squeezed him. "I can always wash your muddy footsteps from the floor," teased his stepmother. "But keep your head clean, Abe, so you won't be leaving tracks along my whitewashed ceiling." Abe grinned, scratched his head, and thought of a joke. When his stepmother went out for a while, he took a little boy with muddy feet, lifted him up, and walked him like a fly across the ceiling. "Abe, I should thrash you," said the stepmother when she came back. But she laughed at the joke instead. And with a pail of whitewash, Abe made the ceiling white and clean again. That is cute. He had a good sense of humor. Often for days at a time, Abe stayed alone in the woods chopping timber. It was so quiet in the forest, and he had plenty of time to think and dream. At mealtimes, he shared his food with the squirrels, and in return, they had to listen to the speeches he made up. The squirrels blinked their small brown eyes, and the trees seemed to sway and bow in agreement with what he said. He made a poem for his sister Sally, and when she married and left home, he read it at her wedding. Abe also left home for a while to be a ferryman on the Ohio River. The great Ohio River flowed by some miles from Little Pigeon Creek, and it was there that he made his first $1. 2 elegant travelers gave him a shiny $50 each for rowing them out to the steamboat that lay anchored in midstream. But as he stood there in his ferry boat, wondering that anyone could pay so much for so little work, one of the coins slipped out from between his fingers. Sadly, Abe saw half of his new wealth vanish in the depths. Here's a picture of Abe. On his little boat, he was starting to find ways to earn some money, but sure enough, it fell down into the water. But Abe hadn't much time to grieve over his loss. Too many things happened on the river. He looked wide-eyed at the boats and listened to tales of the outside world. Then one day, one of the neighboring farmers sent Abe himself out into the world. With a flatboat loaded with hogs and corn, the farmer's son and Abe set off to go all the way down to New Orleans to trade. They drifted with their boat down the Ohio River and into the great Mississippi River. There, Abe needed all his strength and quick thinking to steer clear of the many dangers. Paddle wheel steamers splashed up and down the river so hard that the water churned in a foam about them. Flatboats and keelboats and houseboats and streams drifted into their path. Dangers lurked behind every bend. Sandbars were washed up by the current, and straggling trees, sticking up from the bottom, threatened to pin the boat up in the air like a beetle. Along the shores, river pirates lay in hiding, waiting for nightfall to come. One night, as Abe and his friend had made fast their boat at the bank, 5 vicious pirates came sneaking on board to rob them. But they hadn't counted on the strength of Big Abe. He grabbed an oar, fought them all at once, and chased them far into the swamp. Abe could never forget this night. For the rest of his life, he had a white scar over his eyebrow. So all that training he did when he was young, chopping wood and working hard, made him strong. His quick thinking made them able to survive on the river. Many dangers there. The further south they drifted, the more slaves they saw working in the cotton fields. And when at last they came to New Orleans, there were black slaves everywhere. Some were running about with loads on their heads. Others were led in chains through the streets to be sold at slave markets. Abe was horrified to see how slaves were trotted up and down like horses to show they were strong and healthy. The slave mothers were weeping, for they never knew if they would see their children again when they were sold. Sometimes the one who bought the mother would refuse to take the children, and they would be sold to someone else, and the family would be broken up. Abe Lincoln thought that was cruel. Turning away from the scene, he said to his friend, "That's a disgrace." When all their goods were sold, Abe was happy to go north again. There, all the neighbors came to hear him tell of his adventures out in the big world. They never tired of hearing about the river pirates, but they saw Abe grow solemn when he spoke of the slave markets. And they all grinned broadly when he told of the fortune teller who had said that he, Abraham Lincoln, would one day be president of the United States. Abe's father was listening to stories about Illinois, the new state where folks said the grass grew greener than anywhere else. And we will stop there for today. And I think the story pretty clearly presents how Abraham Lincoln felt about what he saw there in New Orleans. And rightfully so. It is wrong. It was wrong. And later we're going to find how that impacted his life and indeed impacted our entire country. Today you're going to color this picture, and tomorrow you'll write a sentence about it to put in your notebook.